At 9:17 p.m., a man misread a memo on live television. By midnight, the Cold War was over. The night of November 9th, 1989 was cold in Berlin. Gray. Completely ordinary. On the eastern side of the wall, people were in their apartments watching the news the way they always watched it, without expecting anything, because nothing had changed in 28 years and there was no reason tonight would be different. Nobody knew that at a government press conference happening at that exact moment, a Communist Party official hadn't read his briefing notes. That 4 words spoken flatly into a microphone would trigger a human wave that no wall, no guard tower, no shoot-on-sight order could stop. And here's what people forget. The guards had live ammunition. They had orders. One wrong decision. One officer who decided to follow protocol instead of hesitate. And this night doesn't end with dancing on the wall. It ends with bodies in the death strip. The Berlin Wall didn't fall because of armies or bombs or diplomacy. It fell because of a piece of paper. A mistake, and the thinnest margin between a revolution and a massacre. To understand that night, you have to understand what the wall actually was. Not the symbol, the physical reality. The Berlin Wall was not one wall. It was a system. 155 kilometers of concrete, floodlights, guard towers every 300 meters, attack dogs, tripwires, and automatic shooting devices triggered by movement. And guards with written, official, documented orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross without authorization. Between 1961 and 1989, at least 140 people were killed trying to cross. Shot, drowned, buried alive in collapsed tunnels. Peter Fechter was 18 years old when he was shot trying to cross in 1962. He fell in the death strip and bled out slowly while East German guards watched, and West Berliners on the other side screamed for someone to help. Nobody helped. He died 50 meters from freedom while the world watched and did nothing. That was the wall, not a border. A cage built inward, designed to keep people in rather than keep others out. By 1989, it had been standing for 28 years. An entire generation had grown up with it as a permanent, unchallengeable fact of life. You didn't think about crossing. You didn't think about what was on the other side in any practical sense. It was simply there, the way the sky was there. But in 1989, the fixed conditions were cracking. Gorbachev's reforms in Moscow had sent a signal through the Eastern Bloc that the old rules might be changing. Hungary opened its border with Austria in May. East Germans discovered the hole and walked through it. Tens of thousands of them over the summer, leaving their Trabant cars at the border and crossing into a different world on foot. Inside East Germany, the Monday demonstrations in Leipzig were growing every week. 70,000 people on October 9th alone. The government had troops positioned to suppress it. The order to move was prepared. And here's what should have happened. What had happened in China just 5 months earlier at Tiananmen Square. The order was never given. Nobody knows exactly why. Gorbachev had signaled the Soviets wouldn't intervene. Local commanders hesitated. The moment passed, and what survived that hesitation became unstoppable. By November, the East German government was dissolving from within. The longtime leader had been forced out. His replacement was desperate for a pressure valve, something that would release tension without releasing power. The idea: allow East Germans to apply for travel visas to the West. Controlled, managed, temporary. That was the plan. What happened instead should not have happened. On the afternoon of November 9th, the Politburo approved the new travel regulation. It was significant, but it was not supposed to take effect immediately. There was a process. Forms. Procedures. The checkpoints needed preparation. The border guards needed to be briefed. The implementation was planned for the following day at the earliest. The memo explaining all of this was handed to Gunter Schabowski minutes before he walked into a live press conference. He hadn't been in the meeting. He didn't know the details. He didn't know about the delay. He walked into the room with a document he hadn't read properly and a room full of journalists from around the world. At 9:17 p.m., an Italian journalist asked about the new travel regulations. Schabowski found the memo. Read it aloud. And then came the question. When does this take effect? Schabowski looked at his papers, shuffled them, found nothing specifying a delay. Immediately, he said, without delay. And this is where it becomes unstoppable. East Germans watching on television heard a Communist Party official say they could travel to the West. Immediately, without delay, they called their neighbors, their families. They put on their coats. They went to the wall. By 10 p.m., Crowds were gathering at the checkpoints. Hundreds, then thousands. The guards had received no orders, no briefing. Nobody had called them to explain what was happening. They called their commanders. Their commanders called their commanders. Nobody had an answer because nobody at any level of the government had anticipated this was happening tonight. And here's where it almost went very, very wrong. The guards had live weapons. They had shoot-on-sight orders that had never been formally rescinded. The secret police, the Stasi, had files on hundreds of thousands of citizens and units on standby. The military had a plan called Day X for exactly this kind of mass unrest. What had happened at Tiananmen Square in June was 5 months ago and fresh in every government official's memory. One phone call with the right order. One officer who decided protocol mattered more than hesitation. And this night turns into something history remembers very differently. The crowd at Bornholmer Street alone was 10,000 people, pressing forward, chanting, not violent, but completely immovable. The guards were outnumbered, unreachable by command, facing a situation their training had never prepared them for. For a long moment, nobody knew what would happen next. The officer in charge, Harold Jaeger, looked at the crowd, looked at his guards, looked at the crowd again. He had no authorization, no order from above, no guidance from anyone. He opened the barrier. What nobody tells you is how close this came to being a different story. The East German government had the tools to stop it. The troops, the weapons, the infrastructure of repression that had kept 20 million people contained for 28 years. What it didn't have, what had quietly disappeared over the previous months, was the will to use them, because the system had already collapsed from the inside. It just hadn't told anyone yet. Honecker was gone. His replacement had no real authority. The Stasi, the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus in the world, with one informant for every 63 citizens, was paralyzed, watching events it couldn't control and filing reports nobody was reading. Gorbachev had made clear the Soviet army wasn't coming, and the people in the streets had already stopped being afraid, which is the one thing a system built on fear cannot survive. By midnight, every checkpoint in Berlin was open. East Germans were streaming through, some crying, some laughing, some walking in complete silence as if they needed a moment to confirm this was real. West Berliners were on the other side with champagne and flowers and their arms open. People who had been separated for 28 years, families, friends, people who had last seen each other as teenagers and were now middle-aged, found each other in the crowds. And then people started climbing the wall. With hammers, with pickaxes, with their hands. They chipped at the concrete and broke off pieces and handed them to strangers as souvenirs. The guards watched. Some of them helped. Nobody stopped anyone. The death strip, the space where people had been shot for attempting exactly this, became the place where people danced. A structure that had killed 140 people was being dismantled by the hands of the people it had been built to contain. And the guards who had orders to shoot them were standing there watching, because the orders had stopped meaning anything. That's the moment. That specific moment, when the guards stepped back and the people climbed, is the moment the Cold War ended. Not in a treaty room, not at a diplomatic table, on top of a wall, in the cold, at midnight, with a hammer. 3 impacts, all still shaping the world right now. The human cost first. 28 years of families cut in half ended in one night. The wall had gone up while people slept. East German soldiers erected barriers in the pre-dawn hours of August 13, 1961, so that by morning the decision had already been made and there was nothing anyone could do. Brothers woke up separated from brothers. Couples were divided mid-engagement. People visiting relatives on the wrong side simply never came home. For 28 years. And then, on a Thursday night in November, because a man hadn't read his memo, they walked back to each other through open checkpoints with tears on their faces and nobody shooting. The 140 people who died trying to cross did not live to see it. Their names are on a memorial near the Brandenburg Gate today. Most people walk past it without stopping. The political cost second. The wall opening triggered a chain reaction that redrew the entire world map within 2 years. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. Communist governments collapsed across Eastern Europe in months. In December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. 15 new countries appeared on the map overnight. The Cold War, 45 years of nuclear standoff, proxy wars, arms races, and ideological conflict that had shaped every major political decision made by every major power since 1945 was over. Finished not by force, but by a press conference that went off script. The historical cost third, and this one is still unresolved. The world that emerged from the wall's fall was not the clean, triumphant ending that night made it feel like. The expansion of NATO into former Warsaw Pact countries created fault lines that remain dangerously active today. The economic transformation of Eastern Europe brought prosperity to some and dislocation to others. The specific nationalisms that emerged from the ruins of the Soviet system in Ukraine, in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, they didn't disappear. They were frozen by the Cold War for 45 years, and when the ice melted, they came back. The wall fell, and it felt like history had resolved something. It hadn't. It had just moved the unresolved parts somewhere less visible. Pieces of the wall are everywhere now. In museum lobbies, in corporate offices, in private collections. A chunk sits in the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. You can still find standing sections in Berlin, preserved deliberately, so people remember what it meant to live in its shadow. In 1961, soldiers built it in one night while people slept, and by morning the world had changed and there was nothing anyone could do. In 1989, a man misread 4 words into a microphone, and by morning the world had changed again. Some of the most consequential moments in history aren't planned. They're accidents. A wrong answer at a press conference. A guard who hesitates instead of shooting. A crowd that decides tonight is the night and doesn't go home. Do you think the wall fell because the system finally collapsed? Or because the world got lucky that nobody pulled the trigger? Tell me in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.